life. He's going to commune with nature. The church is becoming way too big and ostentatious, and they're concerned far too much with money, and it needs to recenter itself on life and on things that are living, all of God's creation. And Saint Francis kind of injects that into the church and really becomes a hero during even his own lifetime. So by the time that he dies, he is almost at that point declared a saint, just by declaration. And then the second great hero, so that's his church. So this is St. Francis' church. This is St. Francis on horseback, coming back before he decides to leave his family and leave all of his possessions. He's sad at the state of the world, and he's sad about what he's about to do to his family, but he needs to do this for Jesus. And the other great hero is St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas Aquinas is still someone who's studied very rigorously in colleges and in Catholic universities. In fact, what he writes about the Catholic Church is still the foundation of what priests go through in becoming priests. So his theology is very much kind of reintroduces the idea of inquiry, right? So asking questions about why and why does it work this way and why not that way. And so it's really with the help of those two folks that the church begins to become more reasonable. Of course, St. Francis is in the 11th and 12th century, and St. Francis is in St. Thomas is in the 13th century. So we still have the Renaissance to go through. And of course, we have the Reformation. So the next big thing that happens in our church timeline is the 95 Theses. And I think that with the introduction of the Reformation and everything that the church is going through, so the 95 Theses, right? So the underlying issue there, right? Martin Luther hammers these onto the church in Wittenberg, and it's very much about indulgences. Okay? So that was that part what was really kind of bothering him, indulgences. And the indulgences were being created for what purpose? Right. To do what? To build St. Peter's. This is all to build St. Peter's. So that beautiful church that continues to exist today, that no insurance firm will even dare to put a price on, that houses some of the most incredible art in the world, has its direct roots to the 95 Theses and Martin Luther. And I think it introduces the third great debate in the church, and that's how to handle corruption. And if you thought that the church really struggled with the question of who is Jesus, they struggle even more with how to deal with corruption. So here are the list of councils that they've had. Some of these we, of course, are familiar to us: Constantinople and the Lateran councils, all the way through the Fourth, Lyon, Pisa, Constance, Siena, Florence. And then we have the Fifth Lateran Council, and then finally the Council of Trent. And it was at the Council of Trent that they really tried to deal with the Reformation. But of course, in trying to deal with the Reformation, they end up stumbling over themselves. In the church, I dare say, is no more popular after the Council of Trent than it was even before the Council of Trent. And I think even Vatican I and Vatican II, we could argue, is still very much a consequence of dealing with corruption in the church. And of course, the next great event, I think, that happens is the Second Vatican Council. We'll certainly talk a whole lot more about what happens, especially in America, in between the founding of America to the modern age in 2 weeks when we gather. So I'll have more to say about important dates then. But the next big date, I think, in the life of the church is the Second Vatican Council. And I think it's in the Second Vatican Council, and we have elements of it as the First Vatican Council in the late 1800s, but it's how to deal with modernity. So they try to deal with modernity in the First Vatican Council, and they stumble even more badly than they did after how to deal with corruption. And then in the Second Vatican Council, I think they take on modernity in a much more real way than they did before. So that's your history, and I hope we got a little bit of psychology and politics in there too. But I thought that we should now talk about the psychology a little bit of the church. And I think it's important for us to think of the Vatican and where it sits. So we're going to start very insular, and then we're going to work our way out. So in order to understand the Holy See or the Vatican, you have to first recognize that it exists in this place called Rome. So here's St. Peter's, and there's the Vatican Gardens, there's St. Peter's, Castel San Angelo, of course, the Tiber River, here's the Pantheon of Piazza Navona, and over here we have the Forum, and the Colosseum is right there. And so you have to understand first that Vatican City sits in the middle of Rome. And by sitting in the middle of Rome, there are two things that this, I think, helps explain the Catholic Church. The first one of these is that Rome is nothing more than a small village. Right? When, for those of you that have been there, for those of you that are about to go, we'll be able to walk everywhere if we want to and see the great things in Rome because they're all within really a mile or two of each other. And that's the way that Romans think of it still as a small city. So if you're big in government or you're big in banking or you're big in business, you know everyone else in Rome. And it has that kind of small feel mentality. And even more so is Vatican City. So it's even smaller and exists, and it has very much kind of this village mentality. And furthermore, the other kind of interesting psychological note that I think that Rome brings to the Vatican is that it's the eternal city. Right? So the Catholic Church thinks it's old until it goes across the river and it sees the Pantheon. And it sees the Colosseum. And it knows that it's old, but it's not as old as them. And so it gives this kind of eternal mentality, I think, to the Vatican. And then, of course, you have to recognize that the Vatican sits inside of Rome, which sits inside of Italy. And I think that the most helpful lesson I hope that I can impart to you tonight is this understanding of Italian law, or what I'll call Mediterranean law. So there's a difference between Mediterranean law and Germanic law. And right now that I mention it, it becomes obvious to you. But Mediterranean law prescribes optimum behavior. So when the Italians tell you that you can't park there, you can't park there unless if you're in a hurry and you're just going to run in for a minute and you'll be right back, and you just need to grab a soda, or your mom is sick and she can't walk. So it prescribes ideal behavior. Right? Germanic law says, no, you can't park there. If you park there, we're going to tow your car. It describes minimum behavior. So in the United States, we have this mentality very much of Germanic law. It prescribes minimum behavior. So if we're driving, as I was an hour ago, if you're driving 75 in a 70 zone and you get busted, you don't think anything's wrong with the police. You're like, yeah, I got caught. Like, you feel bad and it sucks, but you got caught and you pay your ticket. But if you're in Italy, you're like, what are you doing? You're stuck. I was only going 5 over. I'm late for a meeting. I got to get to Houston. Right? So the church has to operate in this whole thing. So there were great debates after the Second Vatican Council on what to do with contraception. And the difference is all in how you think about Mediterranean law versus Germanic law. So the church says that you shouldn't have contraception. You should allow fertilization to naturally occur. They're prescribing an optimum behavior. If we recognize that as an optimum behavior, then we could do that but, and we could all get along with that just fine. But we immediately think in our, so does that mean we can't use contraception in any instance? And the church is like, we just said, you just don't use contraception. And Americans come back and they're, well, what does that mean? What about in this very, right, if I have a communicable disease and I don't, and the church says, don't use contraception. And so the Americans come back and they're like, well, what about if I just don't have the money, and the church says, all right, we're done with this. You just can't use contraception, period. And if we as Americans or those other kind of Germanic societies would have just accepted the church as prescribing optimum behavior, I think we all could have got along with the church a little bit better. Just recognizing this difference. So recognize the church is all about optimum behavior. It sits in this country where their laws are for optimum behavior, not minimum behavior. So when the church says these things that you think are just crazy, right, to say, all right, that's optimum behavior, but we all live in a society where there are certain things that we need to take into consideration. The church, thank God, gives us free will and allows us to abide by our consciences on occasion. The third level we need to understand is that this Vatican City sits inside Rome, sits inside Italy, sits inside Europe. So Europe, of course, is a very kind of, and I hope Malcolm and Kate will permit me this line, but they're a little bit insular. So what happens in Europe is the most important thing that happens to Europeans. So they're big into austerity right now, and they expect the church to be responsive to their needs. So when Benedict was elected Pope, we all think it's because people are leaving the Catholic Church, and Europeans wanted someone that could have a message for Europeans that would keep Europeans in church. And so it made very much sense to Europeans. It didn't make much sense to the rest of us, at least in that particular context. So we have to understand Vatican City is inside Rome, Rome is inside Italy, Italy is inside Europe, and of course Europe is inside the world. And so when the church hands down decisions, it's not handing down decisions for just Rome and just Italy and just Europe, but it's handing down decisions for the United States, and it's handing down decisions for Africa, and it's handing down decisions for South America. And so when we talk about church time, we're talking about centuries. We're never talking about kind of our time. So they have to wait until there's consensus enough in all the various parts of the world for them to change policy on something. And until there's that kind of consensus, they're going to stick with a mindset that has gotten them that far. 2,000 years of history ain't all bad. Right? I heard a commentator just recently talk about there's no doubt that the Catholic Church is led by the Holy Spirit, because there's no way that the church could survive 2,000 years later without kind of divine inspiration on occasion. So now let's do some politics. I have to catch up. First, we need to do some definitions. So I've been sloppy with my definitions, and I now want to be a little bit more concrete. So the difference between the Vatican versus the Holy See. So the Vatican is this plot of land right there in the center of Rome. That's the Vatican. It so happens that St. Peter's Square there, the papal apartments that up until Pope Francis are here. As it turns out, St. Francis is living back here right now, and he says he's going to continue living there. These, of course, are most of the gardens from the Vatican. That's the Vatican. The Holy See is the church hierarchy throughout the world. So the Holy See includes everything that takes place in the Vatican, as well as all of the reaches of cardinals and bishops and papal nuncios, right? So the Pope's ambassadors to all the different countries. That's the Holy See. So we have an ambassador. We have an ambassador to the Holy See. We don't have an ambassador to the Vatican. The Vatican is just a geographic space. And this, incidentally, this map is of the concentration of Catholics in the various countries in the world, right? So, right, we can glance at that map for a second, and we can certainly understand the decision that was made 3 weeks ago in a whole lot better light. Or for those of you that might prefer, this is the map of the world with respect to the Pope's followers on Twitter. Weighted by population. I bet this map has changed a little bit in the last 3 weeks. So I'm absolutely concerned that there's many more Twitter followers of Pontifex down in South America. And then we're going to contrast that with the Curia. But before we get to the Curia, I'm going to bring you back to American politics a little bit, because that helps me understand the church a little bit better. So this is the executive branch, right? So here's the President of the United States, the Vice President of the United States, and then there's a bunch of departments, right? So the Department of Justice, and the Department of Commerce, and the Department of Labor, and the Department of Education, and Transportation, and Treasury, Homeland Security. And then there are a bunch of independent organizations. Like NASA is one of these independent organizations. The EPA is another one of these independent organizations. The FAA is one. The National Labor Relations Board is another one. So just as there's this kind of structure for the executive branch, so there is for the Holy See. So here we have the Pope, the Roman Pontiff, and then we have the College of Cardinals and the Synod of Bishops. So these are merely advisory to the Pope. Of course, the College of Cardinals takes over the running of the Catholic Church when there isn't a Pope, but then disbands pretty quickly. And then below the Pope is the Secretary of State. I'll have more to say about him. The Vicariate of Rome, that's merely the running of the Diocese of Rome. But then there's the Roman Curia. So this is another that Kate used in her introduction, the Curia. So the Curia is the equivalent to our departments and agencies. So just as the executive branch has the Vice President, the departments, and then all of the agencies, so the Curia has the Pope and then these various other facets. And we'll take a little bit closer look at the Curia. So the Curia, of course, is headed by the Pope, and I wrote down some of the other titles for the Pope. So the Pope has all these titles. So he's the Bishop of Rome, he's the Vicar of Jesus Christ, he's the successor of the Prince of the Apostles, he's the Supreme Pontiff of the Universal Church, he's the Primate of Italy, he's the Archbishop and Metropolitan Archbishop of the Roman Province, he's the Sovereign of the State of the Vatican City, he's the Servant of the Servants of God, and he used to be the Patriarch of the West. Benedict didn't want to be confined to only being the Patriarch of the West, he also wanted to be Patriarch of the East, so he got rid of that title of the of the Pope. So the Pope is no longer the Patriarch of the West because it would be geographic bound. And Benedict didn't view his role as being geographic bound. So the Pope, of course, is at the top of our pyramid. And then we have the Secretary of State. And the Secretary of State we can think of very much as our Vice President. But our Vice President, think of him as having two roles. So the first role is he is the Vice President, so he is helps out the Pope in all of his duties. He's also in charge of think of him as the kind of the mayor of Vatican City. So he's very much kind of the person that's going to tell you who's going to be in which office and who's going to live where and everything like that. So the Secretary. But he also fulfills the role of the Secretary of State as the Secretary of State in the United States government does. So Hillary Clinton or John Kerry. He's the Pope's ambassador to the world. So he has very much a foreign relations kind of background as well. In fact, all of the papal nuncios, those folks who are Pope ambassadors, are all organized through the Secretary of State. So the Secretary of State has very much a worldview, but then very much kind of a mayor's view. So very, very powerful person. In fact, we're all kind of updating our, when I say we, I mean those people who care about the hierarchy of the Catholic Church are updating their Vatican Insider website every day to find out if he's done anything. Because of course when a new pope comes in, when the old pope resigned in this case or dies, all people inside the curia automatically lose their job. So no one has their job inside the curia. And then almost instantly upon becoming the new pope, Pope Francis says, everyone is reappointed to their position provisionally. We're not sure what provisionally means. So we'll see how that plays out here in the next couple months. And the most important decision he's going to make is who he's going to name as the Secretary of State. I think everyone thinks that he will name someone new. Benedict, Secretary of State, caused him lots of grief. In part on his own accord, but also I think people like to dump on him a little bit. And then below the Secretary of State, we have 5 different groupings of things. So we have tribunals. And tribunals, very much as we would think of them in the United States context, they're in charge of all the court stuff. So when we heard about the Batty leaks and the Pope's butler, like that was happening inside one of the tribunals. And then we have the offices. So this is the financial offices. In fact, I just read on this website this afternoon that the Pope is threatening to close down the Vatican Bank, which has been a source of great controversy. Then we have the pontifical councils. So these are mostly advisory. So we might think of these as kind of like the national security advisor to our president. So they advise the president, but they don't have like a office structure and below them in the same way the departments do. And we have curia agencies. These are the administrative offices. So this is the where you get the latest stamps from the Vatican City, or where you get your driver's license and stuff like that. And then finally you have congregations. And congregations are exactly those things, which are departments in the executive branch. And so I thought that we would just talk about some of these congregations in order to understand truly the reach of the church. Of course, the number one, most important congregation is the Doctrine of the Faith. It comes into existence in 1542, but it had been playing a role inside the church even before then, because, of course, through the congregation, the Doctrine of the Faith is where they ran the Inquisition. This is the office of the Inquisition. So when you go to South American places or over in Europe and some of the Spanish sites, they will have the Inquisition office, even from the 16th century still. And then the next congregation that comes into, and I should say that the last person, so there's someone who's in the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith now, who's in charge of it, and that person is called the cardinal prefect. They're always a cardinal. And if they're named to be the head and they're not a cardinal, they would become a cardinal at the first consistory, where cardinals are named. The one in office now is a German. The one before that was someone who was previously the Archbishop of San Francisco, Cardinal Levada. And the person before that, of course, was Cardinal Ratzinger, who becomes Pope. So a very important office. So the next congregation that comes into existence is the Congregation of the Clergy, and that comes into existence in 1564. That's 42 years later. And then the next one is the Congregation of Religious Orders. So the clergy used to handle all priests and nuns, and then when this one comes into existence about 20 years later, they split off those that are normal priests and nuns and those that belong to orders. So those are handled now in separate congregations. And then the next set, these are 1588 is when each of these come into existence. The divine worship and discipline of the sacraments. So it's through that congregation that they decided that we can't use crystal or glass to house the body and blood of Christ, but it had to be precious metal. You have the causes of saints, so they're responsible for determining and evaluating whether or not someone should be named a saint and following the process through the causes of someone becoming a saint. Bishops, the congregation of bishops is the congregation that's responsible for the naming of bishops. They're the ones that got all of the information to try and figure out who should become a bishop, and then find the Catholic education. This one starts off in 1588 as merely a congregation that's going to be in charge of the Catholic education inside Rome. Of course, as the United States and other countries start establishing Catholic educational institutions, it expands its purview. And then just in the 1917, evangelization of the people comes in 1622. So that's propaganda fide. This is evangelization of the world. So the church is organized into areas that have dioceses and have a very orderly, structured process, and that's where all of those things reign. And then where the church is expanding and sending missionaries, that's handled in propaganda fide, evangelization of people. And then finally, in 1917, the Oriental Church is the Congregation of Oriental Church, which we might think is Asia, but actually the Oriental Church is for the Middle East, then to the Orthodox churches in Egypt and Lebanon, for example. And each of these congregations are headed by a cardinal prefect. Their number 2 person is called the Archbishop's Secretary, and then the number 3 person is called an Undersecretary. And that person can sometimes be a bishop or sometimes not a bishop. And certainly anyone who's in charge of the congregation is a cardinal. They don't talk to each other, right? So all of the information goes to the Pope, right? So I'm going to get busy. I'm going to go back, right? So their lines are straight to the Secretary of State. There are no lines going across, right? So all the information goes up. So the congregations make their decisions, and they allow the Pope to either accept them or reject them. And those that he accepts become part of the Catholic Church, and those he rejects we never know about, and we never hear anything about. And the line is directly. So cause of saints doesn't know what the bishops are doing. The bishops don't know what religious are doing. So sometimes you'll have these really interesting combinations of weird things happening. So the person in charge of divine worship and sacraments and under John Paul II was a very strict person. So he thought that there's a very ordered process that we have for weddings and for baptisms, and you say certain words at certain times, and unless those words are said in that proper order, then it doesn't count as a baptism. In the Mass is a very kind of, there's a way to say the Mass, and you don't have women on the altar, and it's very pre-centered. But yet the person who is in charge of John Paul II's personal Masses, so the person that would be in charge of what he does when he's saying a Mass, was someone entirely different, who believed in bringing dancers up on the altar when he was in the West Indies, or when he was down in South America, kind of infusing it with some of the traditions of South America. And so the Pope ultimately is in charge of everything. And so what he says goes. And Pope John Paul kind of liked this dichotomy, right? And it doesn't make sense to us, but it doesn't need to because it made sense to him. So that's the way he had it. So I thought that we would spend a little bit of time just on papal elections, and then I'll open it up for questions. And for those of you that were following the news, everyone was absolutely certain on the day that the conclave was meeting, there were 2 candidates. And those 2 candidates were the Archbishop of Milan, Scola, and then the Archbishop of São Paulo, Cardinal Scherer. And so we were absolutely certain that we were going to end up with one of these 2 guys. And if there was a 3rd candidate, the 3rd candidate was Cardinal Hullet from Canada. And he, incidentally, was the person in charge of the congregation for the bishops. So you can understand why he might be one of those names that's bandied about. If lots of people had gone through his congregation and ultimately becomes a bishop, he's a pretty popular guy. He's the one in charge of promoting folks. So if it wasn't just the 2 of them, then it was going to be the 3 of them. And all right, if it wasn't the 3 of them, then it was, we need to include someone from Africa. So then we included Cardinal Lorenze or Cardinal Turkson. If it wasn't going to be one of those 3, then it was certainly going to be one of those 2. And if it wasn't one of them, we might add someone from Asia, because the church needs kind of a choice. And if it wasn't going to be those 6, then it was going to be a different 6. Right? But we were absolutely certain it was going to be one of those 6. In fact, we were so certain that we got to the top 10 and we decided that we'd start taking bets. So heading into the conclave, the person that was the bookies in London was absolutely certain was going to become Pope was Cardinal Turkson. Of course, Cardinal Turkson, in the weeks leading up to the conclave, gave some interviews that suggested that he was a little bit too comfortable with the possibility of him becoming Pope, that people became a little bit scared that he would be Pope, and so his value fell a little bit. And then we have Scola, and then we have Secretary. I never understood why he was so high up, Bertoni, the Secretary of State. And then we have, of course, we have Roulet, and then Scherer, and then we have some other folks from Italy. We even have an Argentinian. But it's not the Argentinian. it's Cardinal Sandri, who incidentally is the prefect, the person in charge of the Oriental Church. It wasn't the Argentinian that we thought, and then of course we have an Austrian, and then so he's from Budapest, so the Hungarian. All right, so if it wasn't going to be those 10, then it was certainly going to be one of these 12 people. Including, we even have our very own Dolan in New York, and O'Malley. I always want to say Murphy. O'Malley from Boston. But whose photo isn't up there? Popham was Popham? That guy. Cardinal Bergoglio. So how is it that this guy becomes our Pope? So in the way I think about it, I think there are 4 reasons that he became Pope. And I think it's actually helpful for me to go back to the 3. So if we think of these as being kind of the 3 names that were certainly bandied about the most in the media ahead of time, the reason that it was these 3, and I'll start with Scola, the Cardinal of Milan. So he was supposed to be the reformer. He was the guy that understood Italy and understood the way that the Catholic Church worked inside the Vatican, but he was not of the Vatican. So we could expect him to come in with the knowledge and the ability to kind of rein in the dicasteries and all of the congregations and try and get everyone on the same page. He was going to organize, he was going to clean up the Vatican Bank, he was going to clean up the finances. He was our reformer. And then the candidate of the people inside the Vatican was Archbishop of San Paolo, Scherer. So, and the reason that they thought he would be a good job was because they knew that no one of the Vatican really had much of a chance, right? Because one of the big issues was cleaning up, right? We had this huge report. We have someone that we often others. I mentioned his name. Now, perhaps it's too. So,